There's a special bond between a child and their dog, an unspoken connection built on love, trust, and loyalty. For young Emma, her golden retriever Max wasn't just a pet, he was her best friend, her partner in adventure, and her quiet comfort during life's toughest moments. But one chilly winter afternoon, everything changed. Max, who had been Emma's constant companion since she was a toddler, suddenly collapsed in their backyard. His body, once so full of life and energy, now lay still in the snow. Emma's parents rushed outside, their faces etched with worry as they tried to wake Max. But deep down, Emma knew something was terribly wrong. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside him, her small hands trembling as she stroked his golden fur. "Wake up, Max," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't leave me." But Max didn't move. Her parents explained gently that Max had passed away, and the weight of those words crushed Emma's young heart. Refusing to leave his side, she lay down next to him in the cold, wrapping her arms around his lifeless body. "I love you, Max," she whispered, her breath visible in the frosty air. Minutes turned into what felt like an eternity. The backyard was silent except for the soft sound of Emma's sobs. Her parents stood nearby, unsure of how to comfort her. Just when it seemed like nothing could ease the heartbreak, something extraordinary happened. Emma felt a faint movement beneath her arms, so subtle she almost thought she imagined it. She pulled back slightly, her tear-filled eyes widening in disbelief. Max's chest, which had been still moments ago, rose ever so slightly, then fell. A second later, it happened again. Her parents, noticing her sudden shift, rushed over. Emma cried out, "He's breathing! Max is breathing!" And in that moment, the impossible seemed to be unfolding before their very eyes. What happened next would leave everyone speechless, a moment so profound that it would be remembered as nothing short of a miracle. But was it truly a miracle? Or was there more to the story of Max's incredible return? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The sight of Max's chest rising and falling sent a wave of hope through Emma's family. Her father quickly crouched down to check for a pulse, while her mother reached for her phone to call the vet. Emma stayed glued to Max's side, her small fingers gripping his fur as if afraid he might slip away again. "What's happening?" she asked in a voice trembling with both fear and excitement. But no one had an answer. The minutes that followed felt surreal. Max was alive, barely, but something wasn't right. His breathing was shallow, and his body remained limp. Emma's father scooped him up carefully, and they rushed him to the car, heading straight to the emergency animal clinic. Emma clung to her mother in the back seat, her eyes never leaving Max as tears continued to stream down her cheeks. She whispered soft words of encouragement, willing him to hold on. "You're so strong, Max. Please don't leave me again." As they sped through the snowy streets, Emma's mind flashed back to the many memories she shared with Max. She thought about the time he patiently let her dress him up as a prince for her imaginary kingdom, or how he always knew when she was sad, resting his head on her lap until she felt better. He had been her shadow, her protector, her everything. The thought of losing him was unbearable. When they arrived at the clinic, the vet and her team immediately took Max into the back room. Emma and her parents sat anxiously in the waiting area, the cold from outside still clinging to their clothes. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. Emma's mother tried to reassure her, but her words were drowned out by the whirlwind of thoughts racing through Emma's mind. What had caused Max to collapse? Was it something they missed? A hidden illness? And, most importantly, would he make it through the night? Finally, the vet emerged, her face a mix of concern and cautious optimism. She explained that Max had experienced what appeared to be a sudden cardiac episode. "It's rare, but not unheard of in dogs his age," she said, her voice calm but serious. "He's stable for now, but we need to run more tests to understand exactly what's going on." Stable. The word gave Emma a sliver of hope, but it wasn't enough to ease the knot in her stomach. Her father nodded and agreed to whatever the vet needed to do, while her mother wrapped her arm around Emma, pulling her close. "Max is a fighter," she said softly. He's made it this far, and we'll do everything we can to help him." As the hours ticked by, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The way Max had suddenly come back to life felt unexplainable. Was it sheer luck? A medical anomaly? Or was there something more extraordinary happening, a connection between them so strong that it defied logic? She didn't know the answer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far greater than she could understand. The hours turned into a restless night as Emma and her family waited for updates from the vet. They stayed at the clinic, unwilling to leave Max even for a moment. Emma sat in a chair with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the door where the vet had disappeared with Max. Her parents took turns pacing, their whispered conversations filled with worry about what might happen next. When the vet finally came back, her expression was serious but kind. She explained that Max's condition was more complicated than they'd first thought. His heart was weak, and they suspected an underlying condition that had gone unnoticed for years. "We've started treatment to stabilize him further," she said, glancing at Emma. "But he's not out of the woods yet. It's going to take time and careful monitoring." Emma's heart sank. She felt helpless, as though her best friend's life was slipping through her fingers no matter how tightly she held on. But then something the vet said caught her attention. "Sometimes, with cases like this, it's not just the medicine. Dogs respond to the energy of the people they love. Being close to him, talking to him, it makes a difference." That was all Emma needed to hear. With her parents' permission, she was allowed to visit Max briefly. They led her into a small, quiet room where he was resting on a soft blanket, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily. Seeing him like that was almost too much to bear, but Emma forced herself to be brave. She knelt down beside him, just like she had in the backyard, and gently rested her hand on his head. "Hey, Max," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's me. You're going to be okay. You're the strongest dog I know." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled through them, hoping he could feel her love and hope. "I need you, Max. I'm not ready to say goodbye." For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Max's eyes fluttered open, just barely, and Emma thought she saw a spark of recognition. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it gave her a glimmer of hope. She stayed by his side until the nurse gently told her it was time to leave so Max could rest. Back in the waiting room, Emma's parents tried to distract her with hot chocolate from the vending machine, but her mind was racing. What if she hadn't noticed the signs earlier? Could they have done something to prevent this? And why had Max seemed to wake up when she was with him? She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their bond than she had ever realized. As the night wore on, strange thoughts began to creep into her mind. She remembered stories she'd heard about dogs having unexplainable abilities, like sensing danger or knowing when someone was sick. Could Max have been trying to tell her something before he collapsed? And what if this wasn't just about his health? What if there was a reason he came back, something she hadn't yet uncovered? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Emma didn't know what the answers would be, but one thing was certain, her journey with Max was far from over. As dawn broke through the frosted clinic windows, Emma's exhaustion was overshadowed by a gnawing sense of urgency. Max's fragile condition lingered in her thoughts, and every beep of the machines in the distance sent her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved, something she was supposed to understand but hadn't yet grasped. The vet approached with an update. Max had shown slight improvements, his breathing was steadier, and his heart rate more consistent, but they were still far from confident he would pull through. "He's holding on," the vet said softly, her gaze meeting Emma's. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. He seems to respond to you." Emma nodded, determination hardening her small frame. She couldn't let Max feel like he was alone, not for a second. Back in the room with him, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside his blanket, whispering stories of their adventures, the park days, the snowball chases, the way he'd always steal her mittens when she wasn't looking. She even hummed the lullaby her mom used to sing to her when she was scared. Max's eyelids fluttered at times, and Emma swore she saw his paw twitch, but he remained still, his energy faint yet persistent. By afternoon, Emma's parents convinced her to go home and rest while they stayed behind. Reluctantly, she agreed, though her heart felt heavy leaving Max behind. At home, she paced her room, unable to sit still. The emptiness without him was unbearable. Her eyes drifted to the corner where his bed used to sit and then to the window, where she caught sight of the old oak tree in the backyard. Suddenly, a memory hit her. Just a week before, Max had been unusually insistent about that tree. He barked at it relentlessly, pawed at the trunk, and even dug at its roots, a behavior completely unlike him. At the time, Emma had laughed, thinking he'd caught the scent of a squirrel, but now it felt different. Her pulse quickened. Could it mean something? Could it have been his way of trying to? Emma dashed out into the icy backyard, her breath visible in the cold air as she hurried toward the old oak tree. The memory of Max's strange behavior consumed her thoughts. Why had he been so fixated on this spot? She knelt by the tree's massive trunk, brushing away the thin layer of snow that had settled overnight. Her fingers traced the marks Max had made with his paws, the ground beneath still slightly disturbed from his digging. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, grabbing a small gardening spade from the shed, she began to dig where Max had left off. The frozen soil was tough, but Emma's determination pushed her forward. Her mind raced with questions. Had Max been trying to uncover something? And if so, why? The cold bit at her fingers, but she kept going, each scoop of dirt feeling like she was inching closer to an answer. After several minutes of digging, the spade hit something solid. Emma froze. Slowly, she brushed away the remaining dirt with her hands, revealing a small metal box, its surface weathered and rusted. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled it free from the ground. It was heavier than she expected, and the lid was sealed tightly. She sat back on her heels, staring at it with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What is this?" she whispered to herself. She glanced toward the house, half expecting her parents to appear and call her back inside, but the yard was quiet. Gathering her courage, Emma pried the lid open with the edge of the spade. Inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed cloth, was an old journal and a small pouch tied with string. Her hands trembled as she picked up the journal, the leather cover cracked from age. Flipping it open, she saw handwriting that was neat but faded. The words were difficult to read at first, but as she focused, a strange story began to unfold. It was a series of entries detailing a family that had once lived in her house decades ago, a family that had also owned a golden retriever. The entries described the dog as fiercely loyal, almost protective, and the writer hinted at strange occurrences, moments when the dog seemed to sense danger before it happened. Emma's chest tightened as she read. It felt eerily familiar, like she was reading about Max. Then, one entry caught her eye: "If something happens to me, they will come for the dog next. The bond is too strong. The tree, it's the only place to hide the truth." Emma's breath hitched. What did that mean? Who was coming? And why was the tree so significant? She looked down at the pouch, her curiosity tinged with fear. When she untied the string and peeked inside, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a key. But to what? Her thoughts spiraled as she pieced together the fragments of this mystery. Max's sudden collapse, his miraculous recovery, the digging at the tree, and now this journal, it was all connected. But how? And why now? As the wind picked up around her, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something far bigger than she had ever imagined, something that wasn't just about Max, but about her, too. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Emma's mind raced as she clutched the journal and the key, her breath visible in the cold air. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, though she didn't know why. Max's collapse, his strange recovery, and now this buried box, it all pointed to something bigger, something hidden just out of reach. She stood up, holding the items tightly, and ran back into the house, her boots leaving a trail of muddy snow across the floor. Inside, she locked herself in her room and spread the contents of the box on her desk. She flipped through the journal again, rereading the cryptic entries. The family who had lived there before had been afraid, but of what? She turned the pages frantically, stopping when she found a drawing, a rough sketch of the house and the oak tree. Beneath it, the words were scrawled, "The bond protects. The key unlocks." Unlocks what? Emma turned the small, rusty key over in her hand, trying to think. Then, it hit her, the basement. It had an old, locked door they'd never been able to open. Her parents had always dismissed it as a forgotten storage room, but now she wasn't so sure. Grabbing a flashlight, Emma bolted downstairs. She didn't bother explaining to her parents as she passed them, they wouldn't understand, and she didn't have time. She reached the basement and stood in front of the heavy, weathered door. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, it resisted, but then it turned with a loud click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Emma's heart pounded as she descended, the beam of her flashlight flickering against the damp stone walls. At the bottom, she found a small room, empty except for a pedestal in the center. On it lay an intricately carved wooden box, its surface adorned with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the flashlight's glow. She hesitated before opening it, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but something inside her pushed her forward. Lifting the lid, she found a small, glowing orb resting on a bed of velvet. The light it emitted was soft and warm, almost alive. As she stared, she felt a strange sensation, a connection, like the orb was pulling her toward it. And then she understood. The orb wasn't just an object, it was tied to the bond between her and Max. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and when she touched it, a flood of emotions washed over her, love, loyalty, and an unshakable sense of protection. She realized that the orb was the source of the mysterious connection between the family and their dog, and now, it was part of her and Max. But before she could process what it meant, she heard a low growl behind her. Spinning around, she saw the faint outline of something in the shadows, something large and menacing. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. They will come for the dog next. The figure stepped into the light, a shadowy form, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It lunged toward her, but before it could reach her, a fierce bark echoed through the room. Max appeared at the top of the stairs, his body still weak but his spirit unwavering. He charged into the room, positioning himself between Emma and the creature. The orb in her hand grew brighter, and Max's presence seemed to strengthen it. The shadow hesitated, as though repelled by the light. Without thinking, Emma held the orb high, and it released a blinding flash. The shadow let out an ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the room was quiet again. Max collapsed at Emma's feet, but this time, he wasn't lifeless. He looked up at her with tired but trusting eyes. Emma knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. She didn't know exactly what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain, their bond had saved them both. Back upstairs, Emma told her parents everything. They listened in stunned silence, but when Max wagged his tail weakly, they couldn't deny that something extraordinary had occurred. The journal, the orb, and the bond between Emma and Max had uncovered a mystery buried for generations, and it was a bond that no force could break. As Emma tucked Max into his bed that night, she couldn't help but smile through her tears. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. But as she turned off the light, she glanced at the journal on her desk, the faint glow of the orb peeking out from its pages. The story wasn't over yet. The morning after the events in the basement, the house was unusually quiet. Emma woke up with Max curled up at her feet, his breathing steady and his golden fur warm beneath her touch. She sat up slowly, the weight of the previous night still pressing heavily on her chest. The orb, now safely tucked away in the journal's pages, felt like a secret too big to carry but too important to ignore. Her parents, still processing everything she had told them, decided it was best to focus on Max's recovery. They didn't push her for answers, but there was an unspoken understanding in their glances, that something extraordinary had happened, something they couldn't explain. Emma spent the day by Max's side, feeding him small bites of food and speaking to him in soft whispers. He seemed stronger, his tail wagging faintly whenever she said his name. The journal became her guide in piecing together the rest of the story. Over the next few days, she read every page carefully. The family who had lived in the house decades ago had discovered the orb during a time of crisis, much like she had. It had been a source of protection, forging an unbreakable bond between them and their dog, who had become not just a pet, but a guardian. The entries hinted that the orb was meant to stay hidden, its power only awakened in moments of true need. Emma realized that Max's collapse and miraculous recovery weren't coincidences. The bond they shared had activated the orb's power, but it had also attracted the shadow, the very thing the journal had warned about. The orb's light, combined with Max's courage, had been enough to drive it away. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't gone forever. The journal's final words echoed in her mind, "The bond protects, but it must remain guarded." One afternoon, Emma made her way back to the oak tree. Max followed her, his steps still a little slow but determined. She carried the journal and the orb with her, feeling their weight in her bag. Standing before the tree, she knew what she had to do. Carefully, she dug a small hole at the base of the tree, placing the orb and journal inside before covering them with soil. It felt right to return them to where they belonged, hidden and safe. The bond she shared with Max didn't need the orb to exist, it was stronger than anything physical. As she stood up, Max pressed his head against her leg, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude. She knelt down and hugged him tightly, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The danger was gone, at least for now, and their connection had only grown deeper. Life slowly returned to normal in the days that followed. Max grew stronger with each passing day, his energy returning as if nothing had happened. Emma knew their journey wasn't something she could explain to others, not fully, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they shared, unspoken yet unbreakable. In the quiet moments, as she sat with Max by the fireplace or watched him chase snowflakes in the yard, Emma would think back to the orb and the secret buried beneath the oak tree. It wasn't just a story about a miracle, it was a reminder of how love, loyalty, and courage could transcend even the most extraordinary circumstances. And in her heart, she knew that no matter what the future held, she and Max would always face it together.